You youngins, get inside, hurry! At his father's command, Amos scooped up the marbles and ducked into the boat cabin. Jonathan and Clara came scrambling in behind him. Over and over again, they had been warned that such an order must be obeyed, without question and without delay. Fingers trembling, Amos fed the marbles into the pouch secured on his belt and tightened the drawstring. Then he crept back to the patch of sunlight slanting through the doorway. Had his father seen some real Indians? Forced into a narrow channel between an island and a riverbank, the flatboat skimmed dangerously close to shore. To Amos, it seemed like an ideal place for an ambush. "Did you see anything?" Jonathan asked, edging near the doorway. "Nothing yet," Amos replied, glancing over at his little brother. Though only 7 years old, Jonathan looked like a little old man in the beaver hat he wore from dawn until dusk. Something in his face always reminded Amos of their mother. She had died giving birth to Jonathan, and at first Amos and Clara had resented the helpless baby who had taken her away from them. But their resentment didn't last. Jonathan needed them so desperately, and his need seemed to soothe their own raw hurting. Together they had learned to live without their mother. "Why are the Indians after us, Amos?" Jonathan's hushed question brought Amos back to the unseen danger on the river. Their father had said there would be Indians, but he had also assured them that a home in the Ohio wilderness was worth a slight risk. After helping a neighbor's family move to their land in the Ohio country, he had returned with glowing descriptions of fertile soil and trees over 100 feet tall. It wasn't long before he began to talk of moving his family west. "Why do the Indians hate us?" Jonathan persisted. "They don't understand us owning the land," Amos said, repeating what his father had told him. "Or living on it all of our lives. They use the land, but they don't own it. They're worried that if people keep coming, they're going to get pushed out." "But there's plenty of land for everyone," Jonathan said. "Just look at it." He waved an arm at the green, rolling forest, stretching from horizon to horizon. Amos sucked in a breath and grabbed Jonathan's shoulder. "Look, do you see them?" "Indians? Where?" Amos leveled an arm through the doorway, pointing at the riverbank. "There, under the trees. There's 5 or 6 of them, maybe more." Lean, dark forms slipped along in the dense shade, keeping pace with the flatboat. Sometimes they faded out of sight, but then they would reappear, silent, hounding shadows among the trees. At Pittsburgh, Amos had heard the men talking about raids that happened up and down the Ohio River. Suspecting that flatboats were bringing people to settle on their land, the Indians followed the boats downstream, waiting for them to come close to shore. Then they attacked without mercy. But the boatmen were mindful of the dangers, and they kept their flatboats in the middle of the river, constantly studying the riverbanks and the shaded coves along them. And always they tied up on the Virginia or the eastern side of the river at night. Amos spent much of his time scanning the forest too. Not only was he curious about the Indians, but at least once a day his father reminded him that seeing before you are seen could mean the difference between life and death in this wild country. "What'll we do if the Indians swim out to the boat?" Jonathan asked through chattering teeth. Before Amos could answer him, Clara crowded between them in the door opening. "The savages will be well advised to keep their distance," she said. "Papa showed me how to use his pistol. I haven't had much practice, but I can hit an Indian if I have to." Amos stared at his sister and shook his head. She was 12, only a year younger than Amos, and bold as brass. But despite her sassiness and her endless talking, he was usually glad to have her around, especially after that awful time last September. When he had remained silent for days, Clara had understood and left him alone. When he had lost his direction and his will, she had told him what to do. When others had pried and prodded, she protected him. Through it all, she had been his faithful friend. From the moment his father had mentioned they might move, Amos had waited impatiently for the day they would leave. He had hoped that new people and new places would wipe away the bad memories, but it hadn't happened. Even now, he was torn between wanting to remember and wanting to forget. Would he ever be able to think of his friend Simon without trembling like an aspen leaf? "I wish we had never come out here," Jonathan mumbled. "As long as Papa's here, we don't need to worry," Clara said, frowning at him. "But Jimmy Larkin told me that the Indians—" "Sassafras!" Clara broke in. "Jimmy Larkin wouldn't know an Indian from an elderberry bush." "Look, they've stopped," Amos said. He pointed to the shadowy figures at the forest's edge, as motionless as rocks. Suddenly the boat came alive with loud voices, then footsteps on the cabin roof and the creak of the steering oar. "Wheeling Island, dead ahead!" shouted one of the boatmen. Amos let out a slow breath. The Indians didn't dare attack this close to a settlement. He glanced back at the spot where he had last seen the Indians. Maybe he only imagined a lone figure there under the trees, his rifle raised in a silent threat. Their father leaned into the doorway. "They won't bother us now," he said, indicating it was safe to come back out on the deck. Then he went forward to help the boatman. Edging out into the sunshine, Amos leaned against one of the crates crowding the afterdeck. From bow to stern, the flatboat was crammed with supplies for people downriver. He had heard of a few isolated settlements below Marietta. They had foreign, tongue-twisting names like Cincinnati and Gallipolis. Rivers emptying into the Ohio bore Indian names, equally difficult to pronounce: Muskingum, Tuscarawas, Olentangy. The strange names, as well as the shadowy forest, were a constant reminder that they were entering an unknown world. Back home in eastern Pennsylvania, Amos had voiced his fears of wild animals and Indians, and his father had reassured him. 30 years ago, it would have been dangerous to live in the Ohio country, he said. But it's 1793 now, and there are towns and forts and more people moving in every day. Don't fret. By midsummer, we'll be settled and secure. We'll have a cabin built and corn growing. But bad weather had delayed their departure from Pennsylvania, and swollen mountain streams had hindered their travel west. It was already the middle of May, and they were still on the river. Even after they got off the boat at Marietta, it would take several more days to reach their land. They were a long way from planting corn, Amos thought. Clara came and plopped down on the crate next to him, pulling her linsey-woolsey skirt up to her knees. Her hair, naturally curly and fine as lamb's wool, shone like gold in the sun. "Let me have your knife, Amos." "What for?" he demanded. He didn't like anyone using his knife. He had worked too long and hard to get it. He husked corn for 3 days in a row. He carried it with him everywhere in a leather sheath on his belt. It was thin and sleek and had a white bone handle and a blade honed razor sharp. "Just look at my fingernails." Clara stretched her hands out in front of her. The nails were jagged and broken, some down to the quick. "I look like a muskrat that's been caught in a trap and tried to chew its paws off to get loose." Amos grinned at her. She was more worried about her fingernails than she was about the Indians. He pulled out the knife and handed it to her. "Be careful and don't drop it overboard." Clara talked as she whittled at her nails. "Papa says we'll be in Marietta in a couple more days, if the river stays high and there's no fog. Do you reckon there'll be Indians near our land, Amos? Do you think—" Knowing that Clara's questions seldom required answers, Amos stopped listening and gazed downstream at Wheeling Island. A stone's throw from the Virginia shore, it looked like many other willow islands they had passed, but bigger, and there were cabins on it. He could see figures scurrying to and fro. They looked small next to the great Virginia mountain looming over them like a bear over an anthill. The flatboat rode lightly, both pushed and carried by the boiling, brawling river. On the cabin roof, the boatmen waited for the right moment to ply their oars, then, with skillful strokes, aimed their craft at the island's narrow landing. Shaggy, bearded men came running down to the river's edge. "Welcome to Wheeling Town," they shouted over the water. As soon as the boat touched land, eager hands pulled it close and tied it up. The boatman laid down 2 thick planks from the deck to the shore. Clara came to stand beside Amos. "Don't you think they're being a little presuming to call this place a town?" She handed him the knife and moved toward the cattle pen on the back of the boat. Their Jersey cow, undisturbed by the bustle and noise, stood patiently waiting for Clara to attach the lead rope. Amos had thought his sister was raving mad to insist on bringing a cow into the wilderness, though he knew she loved that animal as some girls love their homemade rag dolls. To everyone's surprise, the cow caused no trouble at all. She walked alongside Clara without a lead rope much of the time, crossing mountains and hollows with equal ease. Even the streams were no obstacle to her. She was a better swimmer than many of the humans that she followed, and despite the long, hard journey, she was still giving milk. As soon as Clara led Queen Anne down the ramp, the cow dropped her head and began to graze in the knee-high grass on the island. The boys followed, pausing to watch the men wrestle several barrels and crates ashore. One of the boatmen pointed upstream, telling about the pursuing Indians. The townspeople didn't seem worried at all, and their casual acceptance of the news made Amos breathe easier. "Hey, let's look around," he said to Jonathan, and they set off to explore the island. "Don't take such big steps, Amos," Jonathan said. "I want to practice Indian walking." Someone had told them that Indians walked in a single file in the woods, each person in line stepping in the leader's footprints. Looking at a single set of footprints, a person wouldn't know how many Indians had passed by. Amos and Jonathan had tried it just to break the monotony of the journey west, but they weren't very good at it. "We better not get too far from the town," Jonathan said when they lost sight of the cabins. "There might be Indians." "There aren't any Indians here," Amos said. "There are always Indians on this side of the mountain," Jonathan murmured. "That's what Papa says." Amos walked on in silence. Their father only said that to remind them to be on their guard. But here on the island, among these unfearing woodsmen, they didn't have to worry about Indians. As Amos watched a flock of geese settle down on the Ohio River, Jonathan scampered up into a willow tree that leaned out over the water. The branch creaked beneath him, and when it dipped toward the water, he scurried back to land. Amos grinned to himself. His brother was as much at ease in a tree as he was on the ground, and there were certainly no shortage of trees for him to climb in the Ohio country. When the boys returned to the boat, one of the boatmen directed them to a nearby cabin where supper was being prepared. Inside, Amos saw Clara at the hearth helping a big-faced, boisterous woman the men called Lizzie. Amos was surprised there were no other women on the island, and no children either. After all, this was supposed to be a real town. The meal was mostly meat and fowl, venison, squirrel, turkey, and partridge. What Amos liked best were the flat cakes of skillet bread, so hot that he had to toss them between his hands to cool them off. For dessert, Lizzie served squares of dough filled with dried apples and honey. It was the best meal Amos had eaten since they had left their home in Pennsylvania. When Lizzie learned that the cow she had seen grazing belonged to Clara, she tried to persuade Clara to sell her. Clara just laughed and shook her head. "I'll give you a clock I bought from Virginia," Lizzie pleaded, "and a crock of honey. I'll even throw in a she-coon I tamed." "There's nothing in the world I would take for Queen Anne," Clara told her. Soon after supper, the whiskey jugs were brought out, a signal for Clara, Jonathan, Amos to return to the flatboat. Afraid that Queen Anne would wander into the river in the dark, Clara brought the cow and tethered her to a tree next to the boat. It was a warm May night with the river murmuring past and little waves slapping at the boat planks. The three of them lay on their blankets in the boat cabin, listening to the night sounds and swatting at pesky mosquitoes. Amos never fell asleep without thinking of his friend Simon, but maybe in their new home he'd be able to forget. Maybe his family could forget too. They had tried to conceal their thoughts, but sometimes he could see the remembrance in their eyes. To keep from thinking of Simon, Amos recalled the tale he had heard of 2 white boys captured by the Shawnee Indians years before in western Pennsylvania. The older boy, fascinated with Indian life, had struck a bold bargain with the Shawnee. He promised he would go with them peacefully if they would set his younger brother free. Admiring the boy's courage, the Indians had agreed. Returning with him to their village, they had accepted the boy into their tribe, taught him Indian ways, and years later, in a gesture of great respect, made him a chief. As he lay there in the darkness, Amos thought of the boy who had traded his own life for his brother's. He had become the famous warrior chief, Blue Jacket. Did he ever, Amos wondered, think of his real family and long to see them? I'm going to live in a strange place, he mused, but I'll have my family with me. Amos always felt safe with his father. He heard a whippoorwill call and another one answer from farther away before his eyes closed and he fell asleep. The moment he woke up, Amos knew something was wrong. He heard men shouting and then jumped at the sickening sound of gunshots. Springing to the open door, Amos looked out into a night filled with noise and flashing lights. Clara and Jonathan came up behind him, watching the burst of light that signaled gunshots even before they heard a sound. Like a beaver tail smacking the water, a warning shot rang out through the night. Indians! Amos shrank between Clara and Jonathan. Sharp booming explosions of gunfire stabbed at him like a knife, and he clapped his hands over his ears to shut out the sound. If he couldn't hear the guns, maybe he wouldn't have to remember Simon. A long, agonizing time passed before he realized that Clara had disappeared. He grabbed Jonathan. Where is she? She went out to get Queen Anne. Amos peered toward the shore and saw her pulling the cow up the boat ramp. She's crazy, he muttered. The cow's heavy hooves clattered up the deck, and Amos sucked in his breath and held it. The sound was loud enough to be heard, even over the gunshots. As Clara led the cow into the cow pen at the back of the boat, he crept over to her. You'd risk your life for that dumb animal? He burst out. She's not dumb, Clara spat back at him. And if you think I'm going to let those savages... Jonathan appeared beside them. Hush, sister, the Indians are going to hear you. Clara pushed Jonathan aside. I'm getting Papa's pistol, she declared, and she slipped inside the boat cabin. A moment later, she reappeared, holding the gun in both hands. Amos cringed from the ugly weapon. If there was any shooting, Clara was going to be the one to have to do it. He couldn't. He could never pick up a gun again. Suddenly, the boat rocked toward the shore. Someone had come on board.